She laughed at him for being poor, but years later, he owned the restaurant where she worked. Noah had always known struggle. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, he learned from an early age that nothing in life came easy. As a teenager, he took on every job he could find: dishwashing, delivering newspapers, and later, working long shifts at a small diner in town. His mother often told him that hard work would eventually pay off, but sometimes he doubted it. Every night, after finishing his shift, he would rush to his night classes, hoping that an education would be his way out of poverty. But in the real world, ambition alone wasn't enough. Despite his struggles, Noah never allowed himself to wallow in self-pity. He had a dream to one day own a restaurant of his own. Cooking had always been a passion, a love passed down from his mother, who made the simplest meals taste extraordinary. The only problem was that dreams cost money, and Noah had none. His classmates at the community college often came from wealthier families, and while they spent their evenings partying, Noah spent his nights scrubbing grease off kitchen floors. He was invisible to them, just another nameless worker in the background of their privileged lives. But there was one person who always seemed to notice him: Vanessa. She was everything Noah was not: wealthy, confident, and utterly uninterested in people like him. With her designer clothes and air of entitlement, she carried herself as though the world revolved around her. She and her friends frequently dined at the restaurant where Noah worked, treating the staff with little more than mild amusement. To them, waiters and cooks weren't people, they were just part of the scenery. Noah knew better than to expect kindness from someone like Vanessa. One evening, as Noah cleared the table where Vanessa and her friends had been sitting, he overheard their conversation. "I could never date someone who doesn't have money," Vanessa scoffed, twirling a strand of her perfectly styled hair. "I mean, look at the guys who work here. No ambition, no future. Who would want to end up with that?" The words stung, but Noah forced himself to keep his head down and continue working. It wasn't the first time he had been insulted for being poor, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Still, something about that night lingered with him. Maybe it was the way Vanessa had laughed, so dismissive, so sure that people like him would always remain at the bottom. As he walked home under the dim streetlights, exhausted but unable to sleep, he made himself a promise: one day, things would be different. One day, he wouldn't just be the waiter they ignored. The next time Vanessa and her friends visited the diner, Noah had hoped they wouldn't recognize him. But luck was never on his side. "Oh, look," Vanessa smirked as he approached with a notepad. "It's you again. Still working here?" Her tone was dripping with mockery, as if the very idea of someone holding down a job was amusing to her. Noah forced a polite smile. "What can I get for you?" He had learned a long time ago that responding to arrogance with anger only made things worse. It was better to let their words roll off him, no matter how much they stung. Vanessa, however, wasn't satisfied with being ignored. "I mean, don't you ever think about doing something bigger with your life?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "Or are you just comfortable being a nobody?" Her friend snickered, and for a brief moment, Noah felt the familiar sting of humiliation creep up his spine. But instead of lashing out, he simply nodded. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said evenly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. But as he left the table, he caught the flicker of something unexpected in Vanessa's expression: surprise. As if she hadn't expected him to remain so composed. A few weeks later, the diner hosted a special event for the local college students. It was meant to be a simple gathering, but for Noah, it turned into a night he would never forget. As he made his rounds, balancing a tray full of drinks, he heard Vanessa's voice again, loud and confident as always. "Oh, come on, Noah," she called out, using his name for the first time. "You work so hard, why don't you take a break and join us?" It was a setup. He could hear it in the amusement in her tone, see it in the way her friends grinned at one another. But before he could react, Vanessa suddenly accidentally bumped into him, causing his tray to tilt. In an instant, a glass of red wine spilled all over his uniform, staining his shirt in deep crimson. Laughter erupted around him. "Oops," Vanessa said, feigning innocence. "I guess that's what happens when you're not paying attention." Noah felt his ears burn with embarrassment as every eye in the room turned toward him. His hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he simply turned, grabbed a towel, and started cleaning up the mess. Vanessa and her friends lost interest soon after, moving on to the next topic of conversation as if he had never existed in the first place. But that night, as he stood alone in the empty diner, scrubbing at the stain that refused to fade, something inside him changed. The humiliation had ignited something deep within him, something stronger than anger. It was determination. He would never let someone like Vanessa make him feel small again. Noah had always believed that hard work would lead to success, but moments like these made him wonder if that was true. Was he destined to be stuck in this cycle forever, working tirelessly, only to be ridiculed by people who had been born into comfort? For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Maybe he was just fooling himself with his dreams. But then, as he was about to leave for the night, the owner of the diner, Mr. Harris, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let them get to you, son," he said, his voice steady. "People like that, they don't understand struggle. But you do. And that's why you're gonna make it." Mr. Harris had been in the restaurant business for decades, and though he rarely gave advice, Noah found comfort in his words. Maybe success wasn't about proving people like Vanessa wrong, it was about proving himself right. The next day, Noah threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor. He worked double shifts when needed, saving every dollar he could. Every insult, every condescending glance, he used them as fuel. He refused to be defined by where he started. And while Vanessa continued to live in her world of luxury, completely unaware of the fire she had ignited, Noah was already planning his next move. He didn't know how or when, but one day, he would own more than just his dreams. He would own his destiny. Months passed, and Noah's routine remained the same: work, study, and little sleep. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but he had no other choice. Every cent he earned was either saved or spent on tuition. One evening, as he wiped down the counter at the diner, a familiar customer, Mr. Caldwell, an older businessman who often dined there, observed him with interest. "You work harder than most people I know," he remarked, folding his napkin neatly. Noah, unsure if it was a compliment or just small talk, nodded respectfully. "Trying to build a future," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What's your dream, kid?" The question caught Noah off guard. No one ever asked him that. Hesitating for a moment, he finally admitted, "I want to own my own restaurant one day." The older man nodded thoughtfully. "I might have an opportunity for someone like you," he said, sliding a business card across the counter. "I run a scholarship program for students with potential. I'd be willing to sponsor your tuition if you prove to me that you're serious about making something of yourself." Noah stared at the card in disbelief, his heart pounding. Was this finally the break he had been waiting for? The decision wasn't an easy one. Leaving the diner meant leaving behind the only stable income he had, but the chance to focus entirely on his studies was too good to pass up. After weeks of deliberation, Noah accepted Mr. Caldwell's offer. His last night at the diner was bittersweet. Mr. Harris clapped him on the back and wished him luck, while the other staff cheered him on. But not everyone was pleased. When Vanessa heard about his departure, she scoffed. A scholarship? For him, she whispered to her friends. Please. He'll be back here washing dishes in no time. Noah didn't let her words affect him, at least, that's what he told himself. As he packed up his things and stepped out into the cold night air, he refused to look back. He had spent years being defined by his circumstances, but that was over. From that moment on, he wasn't just a waiter struggling to get by, he was a man with a future. He promised himself that one day, he would return to this town under entirely different circumstances. And when that day came, Vanessa would be the one looking up at him. College was harder than Noah had imagined. The coursework was relentless, and without a job, he had to live on a tight budget. There were days when he skipped meals just to make his money last, and nights when he stayed up until dawn studying, his eyes burning from exhaustion. But despite the difficulties, he thrived. He absorbed every lesson, every business principle, and every detail about what made restaurants succeed or fail. The more he learned, the more determined he became. Meanwhile, Vanessa's life remained untouched by struggle. She still floated through college without a care, attending extravagant parties and dismissing those beneath her. She had long forgotten about Noah, assuming that he had disappeared into insignificance. But life had a way of humbling people, and Vanessa's world was about to change in ways she never expected. Noah, on the other hand, kept his head down, working toward a future that no one believed he was capable of achieving. Years passed, and Noah slowly built something of his own. With Mr. Caldwell's mentorship, he secured a small investment and opened a modest food stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. He worked tirelessly, perfecting recipes, adjusting flavors, and ensuring that every customer left satisfied. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon, he expanded to a larger location. Each milestone pushed him forward, bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. By the time he was in his late 20s, Noah was no longer just a man with a dream, he was a man with a thriving business. He had opened multiple high-end restaurants, each one an embodiment of the vision he had carried for so long. He was no longer the struggling waiter that people ignored. He was now a respected businessman. And fate, as always, had a sense of irony, because soon, the past would come knocking at his door. One evening, as Noah reviewed a list of job applications for his latest restaurant, a familiar name caught his eye: Vanessa. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't thought about her in years, yet here she was, unknowingly asking for a job at one of his establishments. He read through her application carefully. Life had not been kind to her. After graduating, she had struggled to hold down stable employment, and financial troubles had finally caught up to her. She wasn't the untouchable, wealthy girl anymore. She was just another person trying to get by. Noah leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk forming on his lips. Life had come full circle, and he had a decision to make. He could reject her application outright and let her wonder why. Or, he could hire her and see how she handled the realization that the man she once mocked now owned the very place she needed to work. The thought was tempting. But more than anything, he was curious. Had she changed? Or was she still the same person who once laughed at his struggles? The restaurant was a masterpiece, elegant, sophisticated, and already one of the most talked about establishments in the city. As the grand opening approached, Noah kept an eye on the new employees, watching as they adapted to the high standards he had set. Among them was Vanessa, who still hadn't realized who owned the place. She carried herself differently now. Gone was the arrogance, replaced with an air of quiet determination. She was no longer the girl who believed she was better than everyone else. Noah observed from a distance as she served customers with polite efficiency, occasionally stealing glances around the restaurant as if she could sense something familiar. She didn't recognize him yet, but it was only a matter of time. And when that moment came, he wondered how she would react. Would she feel ashamed? Or would she pretend the past never happened? Either way, Noah was ready. This time, he wasn't the one at a disadvantage. Vanessa's first week on the job was uneventful, but there was something about the restaurant that unsettled her. The way the staff carried themselves, the way the customers spoke about the owner, it all felt eerily familiar. She had taken the job out of necessity, never once considering who might be behind the successful chain. She had fallen from grace, forced to work for people she once would have ignored. But even now, she had no idea that fate had placed her directly in Noah's path. It wasn't until one evening, when she was reviewing the staff's schedule, that she saw his name. Her breath caught in her throat. Noah. The memory of the past slammed into her like a freight train. She turned slowly, scanning the room until her eyes landed on him. He was standing near the entrance, speaking with one of the managers. He looked different, more confident, more powerful, but there was no mistaking who he was. Panic surged through her. What was he doing here? And, more importantly, how had she not realized it sooner? Vanessa's hands trembled as she stared at Noah from across the room. It felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. The boy she had once mocked for being poor, the one she had humiliated without a second thought, was now standing at the center of everything. But he wasn't just another employee, he was the owner. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Her mind raced, desperately trying to process how this was possible. She had assumed that people like Noah would remain where they belonged, in the shadows, in the background. But here he was, in a tailored suit, conversing with high-profile guests, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had conquered every obstacle in his path. A knot formed in her stomach as she watched him move, effortlessly commanding the space. She had always thought of herself as superior to him, but that illusion shattered in an instant. Memories of the past clawed their way into her mind, the way she had laughed at him, the way she had spilled wine on his uniform just for amusement. Shame burned in her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to turn and run, but she couldn't. This was her job now, and she had no choice but to stay. But the worst part was the uncertainty. Had Noah seen her? Did he recognize her? And if he did, what was he going to do? For the next few days, Vanessa did everything in her power to avoid Noah. She kept her head down, focused on her tasks, and took every opportunity to slip away whenever he was nearby. But no matter how much she tried to disappear, she could feel his presence everywhere. It was as if he was watching, waiting. Each time she passed him, her heart pounded, terrified of what he might say. Would he call her out in front of the staff? Would he fire her on the spot? The uncertainty was unbearable. But strangely, he said nothing. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't react. It was almost as if she didn't exist. Yet, despite his silence, she knew he remembered. There was no way he had forgotten what she had done to him. Every moment she spent in that restaurant felt like a slow form of punishment, an unspoken reminder of the cruelty she had once shown. At night, she lay awake, replaying every terrible thing she had said to him. How had she been so blind? So shallow? The realization of who she had been, and who Noah had become, was almost too much to bear. But no matter how much regret filled her, she couldn't change the past. All she could do now was wait. Because sooner or later, Noah would confront her. And when that moment came, she had no idea how she would face him. Noah had recognized Vanessa the moment he saw her name on the job application. He could have rejected her, could have made her life miserable the way she once did his. But something held him back. He wasn't the same person she had humiliated all those years ago. He had outgrown that pain, and now, he had the power to decide how this story would end. Instead of immediate revenge, he chose something else: observation. He wanted to see who Vanessa was now. Was she still the arrogant girl who laughed at those beneath her? Or had life humbled her the way it once humbled him? He watched her closely, noting every detail, the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands trembled when she thought he was near. It was clear she was uncomfortable, perhaps even ashamed. But was her guilt real, or was it just fear of consequences? That was what Noah wanted to know. He decided to test her, assigning her some of the most difficult tasks. While other employees got easier shifts, Vanessa was given the worst ones: late-night cleaning, managing difficult customers, handling complaints. He wanted to see if she would complain, if the old Vanessa would emerge. But to his surprise, she didn't. She took every task in silence, working harder than he expected. And for the first time, he wondered, had she really changed? One evening, long after the restaurant had closed, Noah found Vanessa alone, scrubbing the counters with quiet focus. It was the first time they were in the same space without anyone else around. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Vanessa froze, her grip tightening on the cloth in her hand. Slowly, she turned, meeting his gaze for the first time in years. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with unease. I didn't know it was your restaurant," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah studied her for a long moment, searching for something in her expression. Was it regret? Embarrassment? Fear? Would it have made a difference? He asked, his tone unreadable. Vanessa swallowed hard. She knew there was no easy answer to that. If she had known back then who Noah would become, would she have treated him differently? Would she have shown kindness instead of cruelty? She wasn't sure. But what she did know was that she had been wrong. And now, she had to face the consequences of the person she once was. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice heavy with sincerity. "For everything." Noah expected many things from Vanessa, but an apology was not one of them. He had assumed she would try to justify her actions, to dismiss them as childish mistakes. But as he watched her standing there, visibly shaken, he realized something: this wasn't the same girl from years ago. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement had faded. All that remained was someone who had been forced to face their own flaws. And for the first time, Noah saw something real in her eyes. He let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. "Do you even remember what you did?" he asked, not out of anger, but curiosity. Vanessa lowered her gaze, shame washing over her. "I do," she admitted. "I was cruel. I thought I was better than you, than everyone. And I never stopped to think about how my words, my actions, affected people. She took a shaky breath. But life has a way of humbling you. Noah studied her, weighing her words carefully. He had waited years for this moment. He could have made her suffer, could have thrown her past back in her face. But now, standing here, he realized he didn't need revenge. He had already won. Noah had a choice to make. He could let Vanessa go, fire her as a final act of retribution, or he could give her a chance to prove that she was no longer the person she once was. Everything in him wanted to hold on to the resentment, to make her feel what he had felt. But he wasn't that boy anymore. He was a man who had built his own success, not out of hatred, but out of perseverance. And in that moment, he realized something important. True power wasn't in holding on to the past. It was in letting it go. You can stay, he finally said, watching as shock flickered across Vanessa's face. But not because I owe you anything. You stay because I believe people can change. Prove me right. He turned and walked away, leaving Vanessa standing there, her heart racing. She had expected anger, expected punishment. But instead, Noah had given her something she had never given him, grace. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly regret her past. Vanessa hadn't expected mercy. She had spent years believing that consequences were unavoidable, that once you made mistakes, they followed you forever. But Noah's decision to let her stay wasn't just unexpected, it was overwhelming. It wasn't the easy way out for her, in fact, it made things harder. She now had to prove, not only to him but to herself, that she was worthy of this second chance. The weight of his words stayed with her as she worked tirelessly, ensuring she gave no reason for anyone to doubt her efforts. Unlike the past, when she used to take everything for granted, she now valued the opportunity. Each day, she arrived early and stayed late, taking on tasks that no one else wanted. If there was a spill, she was the first to clean it. If a customer was difficult, she handled it without complaint. The other employees noticed the shift, whispering among themselves. Many had assumed that Vanessa wouldn't last, that she would crack under pressure or revert to her old ways. But she didn't. She worked with quiet humility, never expecting praise. Still, she knew that proving herself wouldn't erase the past, nor would it guarantee that Noah would ever look at her without remembering who she used to be. And maybe that was something she had to accept. Though Noah didn't openly acknowledge Vanessa's efforts, he noticed them. He saw the way she stayed after hours, the way she took criticism without defensiveness, and the way she carried herself differently than before. The Vanessa he had once known would have walked away from hardship, but this one faced it head-on. Still, he wasn't ready to let his guard down completely. It was easy for people to act differently when they had no other choice. The real test would be whether this change was permanent. He wasn't sure what answer he wanted. Part of him still held on to the past, but another part, one he wasn't willing to admit, was curious about who Vanessa had become. One evening, after an exhausting shift, Vanessa was about to leave when she saw Noah sitting alone in his office. Something about the way he sat, deep in thought, made her pause. For the first time, she wondered if success had come with its own burdens. Without thinking, she stepped inside and placed a coffee on his desk. He looked up, surprised. "You looked like you needed it," she said simply. Then, before he could respond, she turned and left. It was a small gesture, nothing grand, but for the first time since she had started working there, Noah saw something genuine in her. It wasn't an apology, wasn't an excuse, it was just kindness. And for some reason, it lingered with him long after she was gone. Word spread quickly among the staff about Vanessa's connection to Noah. Some knew the full story, while others only whispered speculation. "Did you hear? She used to treat him terribly in college," one server muttered to another. "And now she's working for him? That's karma." The rumors followed Vanessa everywhere, and though she tried to ignore them, she couldn't pretend they didn't hurt. She had already faced the consequences of her past actions, but now, it felt as if she was being punished all over again. She kept her head down, refusing to react, but inside, the weight of judgment pressed heavily on her. Noah, however, had no patience for the gossip. When he overheard two employees snickering about Vanessa's past, he made his stance clear. "Everyone here has a past," he said firmly. "And unless you're perfect, I suggest you focus on your own work instead of someone else's mistakes." The restaurant fell silent. No one expected him to defend her, least of all Vanessa. She didn't know what to make of it. Was he protecting her? Or was he just setting a standard? Either way, it was the first time since everything had changed that she felt as though she wasn't entirely alone. Despite the rumors, Vanessa refused to let herself break. She focused on her work, determined to prove that she wasn't defined by who she used to be. One afternoon, a particularly rude customer berated a junior employee, treating them the same way Vanessa had once treated others. Watching it unfold, something inside her twisted with disgust. She recognized that arrogance, that entitlement, it was the reflection of the person she once was. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The customer scoffed. "I was just explaining how terrible the service is," he sneered. Vanessa met his gaze without flinching. "We value all our customers," she said, "but we also treat our staff with respect. If you can't do that, I'd be happy to escort you out." The restaurant went silent. The old Vanessa would have never stood up for anyone. But this version of her was different. Noah, who had been watching from a distance, felt something shift in his perception of her. Maybe, just maybe, she had truly changed. And for the first time, he realized that holding on to his resentment wasn't as satisfying as he once thought. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa continued to prove herself. She didn't just work hard, she learned. She asked questions about business operations, watched how the restaurant was managed, and even stayed behind to read financial reports. No one noticed the effort, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he let her actions speak for themselves. The more he watched, the more he realized something unexpected. Vanessa wasn't just trying to redeem herself, she was trying to grow. One night, after an especially hectic shift, she approached him hesitantly. "I know I have no right to ask, but would you ever consider teaching me?" Noah raised an eyebrow. "Teaching you what?" he asked, though he already had a feeling what she meant. Vanessa took a deep breath. How to run a business. How to be better. She looked down, as if expecting him to reject her immediately. But Noah didn't. He studied her carefully, and after a long pause, he finally said, "Show me you're serious. Then we'll talk." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance. But it was something. And for Vanessa, that was enough. As weeks passed, the dynamic between Noah and Vanessa subtly shifted. They no longer avoided each other, nor did their interactions carry the weight of their history. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement of change. Vanessa continued to learn, and Noah, against his expectations, found himself offering advice. At first, it was just small corrections, how to handle an upset customer, how to adjust orders efficiently, but eventually, it became more. One night, he caught her staying after hours, going through financial records, her brows furrowed in concentration. "You're supposed to be off shift," he remarked. Vanessa glanced up, looking sheepish. I wanted to understand how costs are managed," she admitted. "It's more complicated than I thought." Noah smirked. "It always is." He pulled up a chair and, for the first time, actually taught her. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was because he saw how determined she was, or maybe it was because she reminded him of himself, the person who once desperately wanted to learn but had no one to teach him. Whatever the reason, he didn't stop her. And for the first time, Vanessa saw Noah not as the boy she had once mocked, but as someone she genuinely respected. As the weeks passed, Vanessa's transformation became evident to everyone. She was no longer the woman who expected life to hand her everything. She had learned the value of persistence, humility, and hard work. Noah continued to observe her, though now with something closer to admiration than skepticism. She wasn't just trying to earn back respect, she was trying to earn back her own self-worth. He saw it in the way she carried herself, and how she took every opportunity to learn, never complaining even when the tasks were difficult. This was not the same Vanessa he had once known. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Noah found her sitting at a table, lost in thought. "You've come a long way," he said, surprising even himself with the compliment. Vanessa looked up, startled, then offered a small, self-conscious smile. "I guess I had to," she admitted. "Life has a way of forcing you to grow when you have no other choice." She hesitated before adding, "I used to think success was about status, about being above people. But now, I think it's about something else. It's about resilience. About being someone you can actually be proud of." Her voice was quiet, but sincere. And for the first time, Noah believed every word she said. As time went on, Vanessa's hard work paid off. Noah noticed that she had become a natural leader among the staff, offering guidance where needed and stepping in to handle problems without hesitation. Customers began to recognize her, not as someone struggling to get by, but as someone who truly belonged in the business. One day, she approached Noah with an unexpected request. "I think it's time for me to move on," she said, her tone steady but filled with emotion. "I've learned a lot here, but I want to take everything I've gained and build something of my own." Noah wasn't surprised. If anything, he had been expecting this moment. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Do you know what you're getting into?" he asked. Vanessa smiled. "No. But I'm willing to figure it out." There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. She wasn't the girl who once relied on her family's wealth or social status, she was someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And for that, Noah felt something he never thought he would: pride. Not just for how far she had come, but for how far she was willing to go. A few months later, Vanessa opened her own small cafe on the other side of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was hers. She handled everything, from managing staff to designing the menu, using every lesson she had learned during her time at Noah's restaurant. Business wasn't easy, but she no longer expected it to be. Every challenge she faced, she met head-on, knowing that failure was only an opportunity to improve. When she received her first glowing customer review, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Not because she had succeeded yet, but because she had proven to herself that she could. One evening, as she wiped down tables after closing, the door opened. She looked up and felt her breath catch. Noah stood there, hands in his pockets, surveying the cafe with an approving nod. "Not bad," he said. Vanessa smirked. "Coming from you, I'll take that as high praise." There was no tension between them anymore, no lingering weight of the past. They had both moved on, not just from what had happened between them, but from the people they used to be. And in that moment, Vanessa realized that the greatest victory wasn't proving others wrong, it was proving herself right. Months turned into years, and Vanessa's cafe flourished. She poured her heart into the business, slowly gaining a loyal customer base. It wasn't easy, but every struggle only reinforced the strength she had built within herself. One day, as she sat reviewing finances, a familiar face walked through the door. It was a young woman, looking uncertain, holding a job application in trembling hands. I really need this job," the woman admitted. "I don't have much experience, but I'm willing to learn." Vanessa saw herself in that moment, not the girl she used to be, but the one who had once desperately sought a second chance. Instead of asking about qualifications, Vanessa simply smiled. "Everyone starts somewhere," she said, echoing the very words Noah had once told her. She offered the woman a seat, ready to listen, ready to give someone else the opportunity that had changed her own life. And in that moment, she realized something important: success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about passing on the lessons, the kindness, and the chances that had been given to her. The cycle had come full circle, but this time, she was on the other side of it. One evening, Vanessa received an invitation to a grand reopening of one of Noah's newest restaurants. She hesitated at first, uncertain if she should go. But something inside her urged her forward. When she arrived, she found Noah standing among a group of esteemed businesspeople, his presence commanding as always. He spotted her from across the room and, with a nod, signaled for her to join him. She expected to feel out of place, but instead, she felt something else: acceptance. As they spoke, she realized that there was nothing left unsaid between them. The past had once been a weight on her shoulders, but now, it was simply a memory. "I never thanked you," she admitted. "Not just for giving me a chance, but for not letting me stay the person I was." Noah studied her for a moment before smirking. "You did that on your own," he said. And with those words, she knew that everything had finally come full circle. They were no longer adversaries, no longer tied to the mistakes of their past. They were simply two people who had grown. And in the end, that was enough. Years later, Vanessa's cafe had become one of the most beloved spots in the city. People no longer saw her as the girl from a wealthy family or the woman who once looked down on others. She had created her own name, her own legacy. She had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about proving that the future could be different. One afternoon, as she stepped outside, she saw Noah passing by. He paused, looking at the cafe with a knowing smile. "You did it," he said simply. Vanessa nodded. "We both did." There was no resentment between them, no lingering need for closure. They had both found their own paths, and in doing so, had discovered the true meaning of success. It wasn't about wealth, status, or revenge. It was about growth. About becoming someone better than who they used to be. As they parted ways, Vanessa took one last look at the place she had built. She had started from nothing, just as Noah had. And now, standing on the other side of that journey, she knew she had finally become someone she could be proud of.